Chapter 6. By the next morning, her shoulder was singing as fiercely as Mavis on a final set. Eve admitted the extra hours she'd put in with Feeney and a night tossing alone in bed hadn't helped it any. She was leery of anything but the mildest painkillers, and took a single stingy dose before she dressed for the memorial service. She and Feeney had come across one tasty little tidbit. David Angelini had withdrawn 3 large payments from his accounts over the last 6 months, to a grand total of $1,632 American. That was more than 3/4 of his personal savings, and he'd drawn in anonymous credit tokens and cash. They were still digging on Randall Slade and Myrena, but so far, they were both clean. Just a happy young couple on the brink of matrimony. God knew how anybody could be happy on the brink, Eve thought as she located her gray suit. The damn button on the jacket was still missing, she realized as she started to fasten it, and she remembered Rourke had carried it like some sort of superstitious talisman. She'd been wearing the suit the first time she'd seen him at the memorial for the dead. She ran a hasty comb through her hair and escaped the apartment and the memories. St. Patrick's was bulging by the time she arrived. Uniforms in the best dress blues flanked the perimeter for a full 3 blocks on 5th, a kind of honor guard, Eve mused, for a lawyer who cops had respected. Both street and air traffic had been diverted from the usually choked avenue, and the media was thronged like a busy parade across the wide street. After the 3rd uniform stopped her, Eve attached her badge to her jacket and moved unhampered into the ancient cathedral and the sounds of the dirge. She didn't care for churches much. They made her feel guilty for reasons she didn't care to explore. The scent of candle wax and incense was ripe. Some rituals, she thought as she slipped into a side pew, were as timeless as the moon. She gave up any hope of speaking directly with Cicely Towers' family that morning and settled down to watch the show. Catholic rites had gone back to Latin sometime in the last decade. Eve supposed that added a kind of mysticism and a unity. The ancient language certainly seemed appropriate to her in the Mass for the dead. The priest's voice boomed out, reaching to the lofty ceilings, and the congregation's responses echoed after. Silent and watchful, Eve scanned the crowd. Dignitaries and politicians sat with bowed heads. She'd positioned herself just close enough to catch glimpses of the family. When Feeney slipped in beside her, she inclined her head. Angelini, she murmured. That would be the daughter beside him, with her fiancé on her right. Eve studied the couple, young, attractive. The woman was of slight build with golden hair, like her mother. The unrelieved black she wore swept down from a high neck, covered her arms to the wrists, and skimmed her ankles. She wore no veil or shaded glasses to shield her red-rimmed, puffy eyes. Grief, simple, basic, and undiluted, seemed to shimmer around her. Beside her, Randall Slade stood tall, one long arm supporting her shoulders. He had a striking, almost brutally handsome face, which Eve remembered well from the image she'd generated on her computer screen. Large jaw, long nose, hooded eyes. He looked big and tough, but the arm around the woman lay gently. Flanking Angelini's other side was his son. David stood just a space apart. That sort of bodied language hinted at friction. He stared straight ahead, his face a blank. He stood slightly shorter than his father, as dark as his sister was fair. And he was alone, Eve thought, very much alone. The family pew was completed by George Hammett. Directly behind were the commander, his wife, and his family. She knew Rourke was there. She had already glimpsed him once at the end of an aisle beside a teary-eyed blonde. Now, when Eve scanned a glance his way, she saw him lean down to the woman and murmur something that had her turning her face into his shoulder, furious at the quick pang of jealousy. Eve scanned the crowd again. Her eyes met C.J. Morris's. How'd that little bastard manage to get in? Feeney, a good Catholic, winced at the use of profanity in church. Who? Morris at 8 o'clock. Shifting his eyes, Feeney spotted the reporter. A crowd like this, I guess some of the slippery ones could slide through security. Eve debated hauling him out just for the satisfaction of it, then decided the scuffle would give him just the kind of attention he craved. Fuck him. Feeney made a sound like a man who'd been pinched. Christ Jesus, Dallas, you're in street, Pats. If God's going to make little weasels like him, She's going to have to listen to complaints. Have some respect. Eve looked back to Myrina, who lifted a hand to her face. I've got plenty of respect, she murmured. Plenty. With this she stepped around Feeney and strode down the side to the exit. By the time he caught up with her, she was just finishing issuing instructions to one of the uniforms. What's the problem? I needed some air. Churches always smelled like the dying or the dead to her, and I wanted to get a jump on the weasel. Smiling now, she turned to Feeney. I've got the uniforms looking out for him. They'll confiscate any communication or recording devices he's got on him. Privacy law. You're just going to steam him. Good. He steams me. She let out a long breath, studying the media horde across the avenue. I'll be damned if the public has a right to know everything, but at least those reporters are playing by the rules and showing some of that respect you were talking about for the family. I take it you're done in there. There's nothing I can do in there. I figured you'd be sitting with Rourke. Number. Feeney nodded slowly and nearly dug into his pocket for his bag of nuts before he remembered the occasion. Is that to burr up your butt, kid? I don't know what you're talking about. She started to walk without any destination in mind, stopped, and turned around. Who the hell was that blonde he was wrapped around? I couldn't say. He sucked air through his teeth. She was a looker though. Want me to rough him up for you? Just shut up. She jammed her hands in her pockets. The commander's wife said they were having a small, private memorial at their home. How long do you figure this sideshow will take? Another hour. Minimum. I'm heading back to Cop Central. I'll meet you at the commander's in 2 hours. You're the boss. Small and private meant there were more than 100 people packed into the commander's suburban home. There was food to comfort the living, liquor to dull the grieving. The perfect hostess. Anna Whitney hurried over the moment she spotted Eve. She kept her voice down and a carefully pleasant expression on her face. Lieutenant, must you do this now, here and now? Mrs. Whitney, I'll be as discreet as I possibly can. The sooner I complete the interview stage, the sooner we'll find Prosecutor Towers' killer. Her children are devastated. Poor Myrina can barely function. It would be more appropriate if you'd Anna. Commander Whitney laid a hand on his wife's shoulder. Let Lieutenant Dallas do her job. Anna said nothing, merely turned and walked stiffly away. We said goodbye to a very dear friend today. I understand, Commander. I'll finish here as quickly as I can. Be careful with Myrina, Dallas. She's very fragile at the moment. Yes, sir. Perhaps I could speak to her first, privately. I'll see to it. When he left her alone, Eve backed up toward the foyer and turned directly into Rourke. Lieutenant Rourke. She glanced at the glass of wine in his hand. I'm on duty, so I see. This wasn't for you. Eve followed his gaze to the blonde sitting in the corner. Right. She could all but feel the marrow of her bones turn green. You move fast. Before she could step aside, he put a hand on her arm. His voice, like his eyes, was carefully neutral. Susanna is a mutual friend of mine and Cicely's, the widow of a cop, killed in the line of duty. Cicely put his murderer away. Susanna Kimball, Eve said, battling back shame. Her husband was a good cop, so I'm told. With the faintest trace of amusement shadowing his mouth, he skimmed a glance down her suit. I'd hoped you'd burn that thing. Gray's not your color, Lieutenant. I'm not making a fashion statement. Now, if you'll excuse me. The fingers on her arm tightened. You might look into Randall Slade's gambling problem. He owes considerable sums to several people, as does David Angelini. Is that right? That's quite right. I'm one of the several. Her eyes hardened. And you've just decided I might be interested. I've just discovered my own interest. He's worked up a rather impressive debt at one of my casinos on Vegas too. Then there's a matter of a little scandal some years back involving roulette, a redhead, and a fatality on an obscure gaming satellite in Sector 38. What scandal? You're the cop, he said and smiled. Find out. He left Eve to go to the cop's widow and hold her hand. I have Myrina in my office, Whitney murmured at Eve's ear. I promised you wouldn't keep her long. I won't. Struggling to smooth the feathers Rourke had ruffled, she followed the commander's broad back down the hall. Though his home office wasn't quite as Spartan as the one at Cop Central, it was obvious that Whitney kept his wife's lush feminine taste at bay here. The walls were a plain beige, the carpet a deeper tone, and the chairs were wide and a practical brown. His work counter and console were in the center of the room. In the corner by the window, Marina Angelini waited in her long sweep of morning black. Whitney went to her first, spoke quietly, and squeezed her hand. With one warning glance at Eve, he left them alone. Miss Angelini, Eve began. I knew your mother, worked with her, admired her. I'm very sorry for your loss. Everyone is. Marina responded in a voice as fragile and pale as her white cheeks. Her eyes were dark, nearly black, and glassy. Except the person who killed her, I suppose. I'll apologize ahead of time if I'm of little help to you, Lieutenant Dallas. I bowed to pressure and let myself be tranked. I am, as anyone will tell you, taking this rather hard. You and your mother were close. She was the most wonderful woman I've ever known. Why should I have to be calm and composed when I've lost her like this? Eve came closer, sat in one of the wide brown chairs. I can't think of any reason why you should be. My father wants a public show of strength. Marina turned her face to the window. I'm letting him down. Appearances are important to my father. Was your mother important to him? Yes. Their personal and professional lives were twined together. The divorce didn't change that. He's hurting. She drew in a shaky breath. He won't show it because he's too proud, but he's hurting. He loved her. We all loved her. Miss Angelini, tell me about your mother's mood. What you spoke of, who you spoke of, the last time you had contact. The day before she died we were on the A-link for an hour, maybe more. Wedding plans. Tears dripped out and spilled over the pale cheeks. We were both so full of wedding plans. I'd send her transmissions of dresses, wedding dresses, mother of the bride ensembles. Randall was designing them. We talked about clothes. Doesn't that seem shallow, Lieutenant? That the last time I'll ever speak with my mother, I spoke of fashion? No, it doesn't seem shallow. It seems friendly, loving. Marina pressed a hand to her lips. Do you think? Yes, I do. What do you talk to your mother about? I don't have a mother. I never did. Marina blinked, focused again. How odd. What does it feel like? A broken bar. There was no way to describe it. Simply was. It wouldn't be the same for you, Miss Angelini, Eve said gently. When you were speaking to your mother, did she mention anything, anyone who was concerning her? Number. If you're thinking about her work, we rarely talked of it. I wasn't very interested in the law. She was happy, excited that I was coming over for a few days. We laughed a lot. I know she had this image, her professional image, but with me, with the family she was a broken bar, softer, looser. I teased her about George, saying that Randy could design her wedding dress while he was doing mine. Her reaction? We just laughed. Mama liked to laugh. She said, a little dreamy now as the trank began to work. She said she was having too much fun being mother of the bride to spoil it with the headaches of being a bride herself. She was very fond of George, and I think they were good together. But I don't suppose she loved him, don't you? Why? Number. There was a faint smile on her lips, a glassy gleam to her eyes. When you love someone, you have to be with them, don't you? To be part of their life, to have them be part of yours. She wasn't looking for that with George, with anyone. Was Mr. Hammett looking for that with her? I don't know. If he was happy enough to let the relationship drift. I'm drifting now, she murmured. I don't feel as though I'm here at all. Because she needed Marina to hold off on the float a bit longer, Eve rose to request water from the console. Carrying the glass back, she pushed it into Marina's hands. Did that relationship cause problems between him and your father? Between your mother and father? A broken bar was awkward, but not uncomfortable. Marina smiled again. She was sleepy now, so relaxed she could have folded her arms on the window ledge and slipped away. That sounds contradictory. You'd have to know my father. He would refuse to let it bother him, or at least to let it affect him. He's still friendly with George. She blinked down at the glass in her hand as if she'd just realized it was there, and took a delicate sip. I don't know how he might have felt if they had decided to marry, but well, that isn't an issue now. Are you involved in your father's business, Miss Angelini? In the fashion arm. I do all the buying for the shops in Rome and Milan, have the final say as to what's exported to our shops in Paris and New York and so forth. Travel a bit to attend shows, though I don't care much for traveling. I hate going off planet, don't you? Eve realized she was losing her. I haven't done it. Oh, It's horrid. Randy likes it, says it's an adventure. What was I saying? She pushed a hand through her lovely golden hair, and Eve rescued a glass before it could tumble to the floor. About the buying, I like to buy clothes. Other aspects of the business never interested me. Your parents and Mr. Hammett were all stockholders in a company called Mercury. Of course, we use Mercury exclusively for our shipping needs. Her eyelids drooped. It's fast, dependable. There were no problems that you know of, in that or any other of your family holdings? No. None at all. It was time to try a different tack. Was your mother aware of Randall Slade's gambling debts? For the first time Irina showed a spark of life, and the life was anger, flashing in the pale eyes. She seemed to snap awake. Randall's debts were not my mother's concern, but his, and mine. We're dealing with them. You didn't tell her? There was no reason to worry her about something that was being handled. Randall has a problem with gambling, but he's gotten help. He doesn't wager anymore. The debts are considerable. They're being paid, Irina said hollowly. Arrangements have been made. Your mother was a wealthy woman in her own right. You'll inherit a large portion of your estate. Either the tranks or grief dulled Irina's wits. She seemed oblivious to the implication. Yes, but I won't have my mother, will I? I won't have Mama. When I marry Randall, she won't be there. She won't be there, she repeated, and began to weep quietly. David Angelini wasn't fragile. His emotions showed themselves in stiff impatience with undercurrents of chained rage. For all appearances, this was a man insulted as the very idea that he would be expected to speak to a cop. When Eve sat across from him in Whitney's office, he answered her questions briefly in a clipped, cultured voice. Obviously it was some maniac she'd prosecuted who did this to her, he stated. Her work brought her entirely too close to violence. Did you object to her work? I didn't understand why she loved it, why she needed it. He lifted the glass he'd brought with him and drank. But she did. And in the end, it killed her. When did you see her last? On March 18th. My birthday. Did you have contact with her since then? I spoke with her about a week before she died. Just a family call. We never went more than a week without speaking. How would you describe her mood? Obsessed with Irina's wedding. My mother never did things by halves. She was planning the wedding as meticulously as she did any of her criminal cases. She was hoping it would rub off on me. What would? The wedding fever. My mother was a romantic woman under the prosecutor's armor. She hoped I would find the right mate and make a family. I told her I'd leave that to Irina and Randy and stay married to business a while. You're actively involved in Angelini exports. You'd be aware of the financial difficulties. His face tightened. They're blips, Lieutenant. Bums. Nothing more. My information indicates there are more serious difficulties than blips and bums. Angelini is solid. There's simply a need for some reorganization, some diversification, which is being done. He flicked a hand, elegant fingers, a sparkle of gold. A few key people have made unfortunate mistakes that can and will be rectified, and that has nothing to do with my mother's case. It's my job to explore all angles. Mr. Angelini, your mother's estate is substantial. Your father will come into a number of holdings, as will you. David got to his feet. You're speaking of my mother. If you suspect that anyone in the family would cause her harm, then Commander Whitney has made a monstrous error in judgment putting you in charge of the investigation. You're entitled to your opinion. Do you gamble, Mr. Angelini? What business is that of yours? Since he was going to stand, he rose to face him. It's a simple question. Yes, I gamble on occasion, as do countless others. I find it relaxing. How much do you owe? His fingers tightened on the glass. I believe at this point, my mother would have advised me to consult counsel. That's certainly your right. I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Angelini. I'm fully aware that you were in Paris on the night of your mother's death, just as she was fully aware that shuttles skimmed across the Atlantic hourly. It's my job to get a clear picture, a full and clear picture. You're under no obligation to answer my question, but I can, with very little trouble, access that information. The muscles in his jaw worked a moment. 800,000. Give or take a few dollars. Are you unable to settle the debt? I am neither a welcher nor a pauper, Lieutenant Dallas, he said stiffly. It can and will be settled shortly. Was your mother aware of it? Neither am I a child, Lieutenant. who needs to run to his mother for help whenever he skins a knuckle. You and Randall Slade gambled together. We did. My sister disapproves, so Randy has given up the hobby. Not before he incurred debts of his own. His eyes, very like his father's, chilled. I wouldn't know about that, nor would I discuss his business with you. Oh yes, you would, Eve thought, but let it slide for the moment. And the trouble in Sector 38 a few years ago? You were there? Sector 38, he looked convincingly blank. A gambling satellite. I often go to Vegas too for a quick weekend, but I don't recall patronizing a casino in that sector. I don't know what trouble you're referring to. Do you play roulette? No. It's a fool's game. Randy's fond of it. I prefer blackjack. Randall Slade didn't look like a fool. He looked to Eve like a man who could knock anything out of his path without breaking stride. Nor was he her image of a fashion designer. He dressed simply, his black suit unadorned by any of the studs or braids currently in fashion, and his wide hands had the look of a laborer rather than an artist. I hope you'll be brief, he said in the tone of a man used to giving orders. My Irina is upstairs lying down. I don't want to leave her for long. Then I'll be brief. Eve didn't object when he took out a gold case containing 10 slim black cigarettes. Technically, she could have, but she waited until he'd lighted one. What was your relationship with Prosecutor Towers? We were friendly. She was soon to become my mother-in-law. We shared a deep love for my Irina. She approved of you. I have no reason to believe otherwise. Your career has benefited quite a lot through your association with Ongolini Exports. True. He blew out smoke that smelled lightly of lemon mint. I like to think Ongolini has also benefited quite a lot through their association with me. He surveyed Eve's gray suit. That cut and color are both incredibly unflattering. You might want to take a look at my on-the-rack line here in New York. I'll keep it in mind. Thanks. I dislike seeing attractive women in unattractive clothes. He smiled and surprised Eve with a flare of charm. You should wear bolder colors, sleeker lines. A woman with your build would carry them well. So I'm told, she muttered, thinking of Rourke. You're about to marry a very wealthy woman. I'm about to marry the woman I love. It's a happy coincidence that she's wealthy. It is, and money is something you have a need for. Don't we all? Smooth, unoffended, again amused. You have debts, Mr. Slade. Large, outstanding debts in an area that can cause considerable pain in the collecting process. That's accurate. He drew smoke in again. I'm a gambling addict, Lieutenant, recovering. With my Irina's help and support, I've undergone treatment. I haven't made a wager in 2 months. 5 days. Roulette, wasn't it? I'm afraid so. And the amount you owe, in round figures, 500,000. And the amount of your fiancé's inheritance, probably triple that, in round figures. More, considering the stocks and holdings that wouldn't be converted into credit or cash. Killing my fiancé's mother would certainly have been one way to solve my financial difficulties. He stubbed his cigarette out thoughtfully. Then again, so would the contract I've just signed for my fall line. Money isn't important enough to me to kill for it. But gambling was important enough. Gambling was like a beautiful woman. Desirable, exciting, capricious. I had a choice between her and my Irina. There was nothing I wouldn't do to keep my Irina. Nothing. He understood, and inclined his head. Nothing at all. Does she know about the scandal in Sector 38? His amused, faintly smug expression froze, and he paled. That was nearly 10 years ago. That has nothing to do with my Irina. Nothing to do with anything. You haven't told her. I didn't know her. I was young, foolish, and I paid for my mistake. Why don't you explain to me, Mr. Slade, how you came to make that mistake? It has nothing to do with this. Indulge me, damn it. It was one night out of my life. One night, I'd had too much to drink, was stupid enough to mix the liquor with chemicals. The woman killed herself. It was proven the overdose was self-inflicted. Interesting, Eve thought. But you were there, she hazarded. I was zoned. I'd lost more heavily than I could afford at roulette, and between us we made a scene. I told you I was young. I blamed my bad luck on her. Maybe I did threaten her. I just don't remember. Yes, we argued publicly. She struck me, and I struck her back. I'm not proud of it. Then I just don't remember. Don't remember, Mr. Slade? As I testified, the next thing I remember is waking up in some filthy little room. We were in bed, naked, and she was dead. I was still groggy. Security came in. I must have called them. They took pictures. I was assured the pictures were destroyed after the case was closed and I was exonerated. I barely knew the woman," he continued, heating up. "I'd picked her up in the bar or thought I had. My attorney discovered she was a professional companion, unlicensed, working the casinos." He closed his eyes. "Do you think I want Myrina to know that I was, however briefly, accused of murdering an unlicensed whore?" "No," Eve said quietly. "I don't imagine you do. And as you said, Mr. Slade, you'd do anything to keep her. Anything at all." Hammett was waiting for her the moment she stepped out of the commander's office. The hollows in his cheeks seemed deeper, his skin grayer. "I'd hoped to have a moment, Lieutenant." "Hey Eve." She gestured behind her. "Let him slip into the room first, then close the door on the murmurs of conversation. This is a difficult day for you, George." "Yes, very difficult." "I wanted to ask, needed to know a broken bar. Is there anything more?" "Anything at all. The investigation's proceeding. There's nothing I can tell you that you wouldn't have heard through the media." "There must be more." His voice rose before he could control it. "Something." She could feel pity. Even when there was suspicion, everything that can be done is being done. "You've interviewed Marco, her children, even Randy. If there is anything they knew, anything they told you that might help, I have a right to be told." "Nerves?" she wondered. "Or a grief?" "No," she said quietly, "you don't. I can't give you any information acquired during an interview or through investigative procedure. We're talking about the murder of the woman I loved." He exploded with it, his pale face flushing dark. "We might have been married." "Were you planning to be married, George?" "We discussed it." He passed a hand over his face, a hand that shook slightly. "We discussed it," he repeated, and the flush washed away from his skin. "There was always another case, another summation to prepare. There was supposed to be plenty of time." With his hands balled into fists, he turned away from her. "I apologize for shouting at you. I'm not myself." "It's all right, George." "I'm very sorry." "She's gone." He said it quietly, brokenly. "She's gone." There was nothing left for her to do but give him privacy. She closed the door behind her, then rubbed a hand at the back of her neck where tension was lodged. On her way out, Eve signaled to Feeney. "Need you to do some digging," she told him as they headed outside. "Old case, about 10 years past, on one of the gambling hells in Sector 38. "What you got?" "Dallas. Sex, scandal, and probable suicide." "Accidental." "Hot damn," Feeney said mournfully. "And I was hoping to catch a ball game on the screen tonight. This should be just as entertaining." She spied Rourke helping the blonde into his car, hesitated, then detoured past him. "Thanks for the tip, Rourke." "Anytime, Lieutenant." "Feeney," he added with a brief nod before he slipped into the car. "Hey," Feeney said when the car glided away. "He's really pissed at you." "He seemed fine to me," Eve muttered and wrenched open her car door. Feeney snorted. "Some detective you are, pal." "Just dig up the case, Feeney." "Randall Slade's the accused." She slammed her door and sulked.